Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for travelling so far. I know some of you are from rather far-flung places to help us celebrate a remarkable collection of poetry written by, as most of you will know, a very remarkable man. This is the book in question, Talking to Stanley on the Telephone. I'll be asking Michael about his American publisher, who I happen to know is called Stanley. This book represents a departure, I think, in Michael's poems. It's got his usual virtuoso and extraordinary facility with language, but he's also got a depth and playfulness that makes him a really wonderful poet, I think. I'm going to say a few things to start with, which are not to do with Carcanet. I'm guessing that most people know about Carcanet, particularly with the high-profile events that happened a couple of years ago on the 50th anniversary of the press, when a remarkable book called 50 Letters Across the 50 Years of Carcanet's publication of something like 1,600 books, 1,600, some of them extraordinarily big and groundbreaking and essential books. But that's not what we're going to talk about tonight. I could also talk about, for instance, this canonical collection, the essential book of 20th century poetry in English, or the great modern poets. Or even, this is a lovely book, a book of Keats. It's the Penguin brought out with Michael writing an introduction of these first editions, which were the collections just as they were originally published by such poets as Keats. Michael wasn't alive at that time, but he does. What is remarkable about this new book is that it is a young man's book, I think, looking back. We're going to hear around 30 minutes of Michael reading. It will be broken into three sections. And after the first one, I'll ask Michael, he's going to read 4 poems from from the earlier selection, from his collected poems, in fact, which he boiled down to a very selected poems. He's going to read 4 poems. After that, I'll talk to him a little bit about his earlier writing career, not mentioning his 2 early novels, for instance, or The Story of Poetry, or Lives of the Poets, or the novel of Biography, which I could do. We'll just talk about those poems. And then Michael will tell us a little bit about this, the new book, and he'll read more extendedly from that book. After which, we're hoping that you'll be posting through some questions for us to ask Michael. But can I ask you to welcome Michael Schmidt reading from this amazing new book, Talking to Stanley on the Telephone.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. It's a joy to be introduced by you, who have published me for about 35 years. Of course, I've published you as well. It's a very strange symbiotic relationship. You didn't have as much hair, I think, last time I saw you. This is something I hope can be remedied. The first poem I'll read is called Third Persons, written quite a long time ago, based on a short story by Chekhov. It's in rhymed 6-line stanzas, with a long line and a short line. If only he hadn't answered the door. Sorry, it's Third Persons is the title. If only he hadn't answered the door when she knocked, the phone when she called. If when he started to write his most brilliant story, he'd expunged her arrival, choosing instead to introduce an easier lover, or in place of marriage, travel. It's chilling to witness her coming, her hand on the knocker. He was older, maybe, settled. She came with tears and charm and magic, perhaps. I don't recall. Startled into a posture of love, and grateful she was, after all, young, beautiful. He embraced her, and for a decade more, let himself believe he loved her, even after her eyes turned and her head in so many obvious directions, and her laughter spread like pink blossom over numerous other lawns, spread deeper and softer. And blithely she gave herself up to many surprises of love. He could not finish it. He could not close the poison chapter. He could not breathe. He gave her the benefit of every single doubt, resisting, yet at last he threw the story out. The second poem is a kind of little allegory, which I've always liked. I'm not quite sure why. It's called Choice. And it's in short lines, which don't rhyme, but feel as though they do. Each one has the same kind of weight. I am like the worm. Cut in two, I'd thrive. Within the metaphor, I greet myself. I take my right hand in my right, and looking eye to eye, I'm satisfied. I need a knife to make it true, a simple slice and clean. Another lover, too. The worm resembles me. The rough dark hardens it. Within the metaphor, it only knows it is, and not which way it goes, to what, from what, how far. I want a blade to fall between me, so I move forward, fore and aft, and double the odds for love. The worm and I emerge into the rainy light. We wander on the lawn and lose our entrances. I kneel on a flagstone and press it with my thumb. It twists into a ring and writhes away again. Here resemblance ends, like casual marriages. The next poem I wrote for a person who is still, in fact, my partner many years later. It was written about 30 years ago. His father was a baker, he the youngest son. I understand they beat him and they loved him. His father was a baker in Oaxaca. I understand his bakery was the best, and his 3 sons and all his daughters helped as children with the baking and the pigs. I can imagine chickens in their patio. At Christmas time, a wattled turkey cock, a dog weathered like a washboard, yellow-eyed, that no one stroked but ate the scraps of bread and yapped to earn his keep. I understand the family prospered, though the father drank, and now the second brother drinks, often to excess. I understand as well that love came early, bladed, and then went away, and came again in other forms, some foreign, and took him by the heart away from home. His father was a baker in Oaxaca, and here I smell the loaves that rose in ovens throughout a childhood not yet quite complete, and smell the fragrance of his jet black hair, taste his sweet dialect that is mine too, until I understand I am to be a baker, up before dawn with trays and trays of dough, to feed him this day, next day, and forever, or for a time, the honey-colored loaves. My spell corrector on my old computer, once I was writing an essay on Hamlet, I typed "Alas, poor Yorick," and it corrected "alas" to "also." So the poem that I wrote is called "Also, Poor Yorick," and this is it. Yorick's heart is moved. How beautiful, he says, and grasps then what it must mean to be human, returning rested from the afterlife into the lovely dew of resurrection. Bare feet with the worms and roots still in them, the puddles cool between his metatarsals. The skulls bay with joy, and all are grinning, popping their knuckles, counting their vertebrae. And now they dance alone and now join hands. And as they dance there, in their ribs and rigging, in each gray skeleton a robin perches, plumping its feathers, pulsing out its song, red and the twittering's blood as well as music. Never has he witnessed a scene so vital, the dance of life, the scripture guaranteed. Faster as shadows shorten and noon rises, the skeletons spin and conga into the air, making a cloud, a halo on the sun. He takes his spade and sets it on his shoulder. He's old. Till now he's known so much regret. He's buried his grandparents and his parents, his kings and queens, his brothers and his friends, his lovers, all of them consumables, Kinis, pulvis, nihil. the bones bearing in their chalk wholeness so much love and light. In his own graveyard, with the dear departed, one unfamiliar skeleton stands up, tall, gracious, folding down his finger bones over two holes, where his hurt feet strike stone, sparks from the rusty nails, and in his side a spear, perch for a phoenix. Jesus Christ risen in this garden, and the wounds or the bones that keep the marks of wounds are singing. It's noon, there are no shadows. This is true. He raised them and himself is rising up. Also poor Yorick, and that was judgment. It is over. Later in the day, the prince arrives, stepping from his script as from a carriage, drawn up among the holes in which the dead waited, and from which they are all delivered, just like an audience when the play is over, elbowing their coats into the dark. Anxious, a bit deranged, he finds occasion to hold a conversation with a skull. Is it a skull or a stone that looks like a skull? The heads are all gone to heaven, Jesus too. The sexton himself put off his flesh and followed. Ophelia was already on her star. Poor prince, alone with just a book of ballads, with just the plot nothing can raise him from. That finishes the first section.
Oh, thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you in a minute, if you will, to read also Poor Yorick again. It's such a rich poem. I don't mind embarrassing you in this way by saying that it's one of my favourite poems by anyone. And there are many of your poems that are favourites. But there's so much in there, and I happen to like hearing poems twice. I'm sure everyone would be glad if you would. Can I ask you, though, first of all, a little bit about the early poems and how you started writing poems, I mean?
I don't remember how I started writing. I remember as a very young child writing sonnets to every red letter day in the calendar and sending them to my grandmother, who kept them. And I received the book back many years later and didn't preserve it. So I think I've always been interested in form and informal language and in language games. And I must have started writing poetry seriously in my late teens and continued until it more or less dried up until relatively recently. But it's hard to know where it starts. I think possibly being initially bilingual in Spanish and English, and the kind of interesting kind of, what would you say, transactions between the two languages in one's own head. Finding equivalences which aren't equivalent and finding how much richer one language is than the other in certain areas. So it was a fascination, I think, with language rather than with subject matter, though that, I guess, does come in from time to time.
Yes. And when were you always, did you always know that you were going to be a poet? Was there anything else that you are a publisher, you're also a professor, but you're first of all a poet, aren't you?
No, I think I'm first of all probably a publisher. I do the poems that I've written that I like very much, and I'm happy I've written them. And I think a couple of them may even stand the test of a generation or two. But I think my main contribution to the poetry scene has been publishing other people, finding new poets, really finding old poets as well who have been overlooked. And that's been a tremendous joy. And I think you probably have this as well. You know, the pleasure in other people's success is really quite intense, isn't it? You know, vicarious pleasure.
Yes, I remember you saying that it was difficult if anyone offered you a reading somewhere or there was some way of advancing your own career, you felt you ought to put a Carcanet poet in your place. It's inevitable, I suppose, with your kind of modest outlook. But there are times when you are certainly nothing more. I mean, you're also wonderful. You created a couple of rather marvelous anthologies and written this, you know, this book. Not to mention the biography, the novel book. That would be life's work for anyone. But I want to mention Also Poor Yorick is from The Stories of My Life, which is, I think, 2013. But an earlier book, The Resurrection of the Body, I think you wrote that mostly with Virgin Trains. Didn't you write that with old Richard Branson?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yes, I had stopped writing actually, and I took a job at the University of Glasgow and was traveling up and down the map every week. It's a relatively long train trip, and I discovered that between here and Lancaster, I would generate one or two stanzas of a poem, which I would then complete in the remainder of the journey from Lancaster to Glasgow. And it was a really big surprise because I didn't think I was going to write again. And the poems that came out were really quite long. It was being a long journey. I mean, if I'd only been going as far as Buxton, I would have written a series of haikus. But and that was I really was very grateful. Then as the work in Glasgow became more and more demanding, of course, one was doing the work on the way up and down rather than writing poems. But yes, I do think poems do come by surprise, don't they?
It was a surprise to us in the office because practically once a week, a new and extraordinary cantor de force poem was arriving, that you were sending them in as you wrote them, and that was a really wonderful experience for us. I'm going to ask you to, perhaps, do you want to say something about also Poor Yorick, apart from the spell checker that...
It's a poem that took me quite by surprise. I didn't know which direction it was going to go in. And it must have been around the time when there was that World Cup when David Beckham had hurt his foot. And that's where the word metatarsals comes from, because I worked out what a metatarsal was. So sometimes you can date a poem by peculiarity in the diction. And again, my relationship with the Anglican religion is, I think, intense, and though ironic, is also very deep. I don't think irony precludes depth, does it? It's a way of not falling in. And I think that this notion of the humble man whose skull Hamlet was having a dialogue with, this man deserved his own poem. And I also love this poem, The Cookham Resurrection, with all the bodies coming out of their tombs, which you actually kindly put on the cover of that book that you just held up, yes. And Stanley Spencer. And so I think that was probably in my mind as well. That also affects one of the poems I'll read later, the one from my mother about the tombstone. He's a painter who I really find fascinating. There's so much narrative in it. So I think that was probably it. Yeah.
If you will, if you read also Poor Yorick, and then so that I don't have to come in and throw my hair about, if you go straight on to reading from Talking to Stanley and say a little bit about it. Okay. And I know that I don't need to remind people will be sending in questions on chat for us to put to you after the reading. And but I'm going to ask you to read also Poor Yorick. I'm going to disappear.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that again then. Yorick's heart is moved. How beautiful, he says, and grasps then what it must mean to be human, returning rested from the afterlife into the lovely dew of resurrection. Bare feet with the worms and roots still in them, the puddles cool between their metatarsals. The skulls bay with joy, and all are grinning, popping their knuckles, counting their vertebrae. And now they dance alone and now join hands, and as they dance there, in their ribs and rigging, in each grey skeleton a robin perches, plumping its feathers, pulsing out its song. Red, and the twittering's blood as well as music. Never has he witnessed a scene so vital, the dance of life, the scripture guaranteed. Faster as shadows shorten and noon rises, the skeletons spin and conga into the air, making a cloud, a halo on the sun. He takes his spade and sets it on his shoulder. He's old. Till now he's known so much regret. He's buried his grandparents and his parents, his kings and queens, his brothers and his friends, his lovers, all of them consumables. Cinis, pulvis, nihil, the bones bearing in their chalk wholeness so much love and light. In his own graveyard, with the dear departed, one unfamiliar skeleton stands up, tall, gracious, folding down his finger bones over two holes. Where his hurt feet strike stone, sparks from the rusty nails, and in his side a spear, perch for a phoenix, Jesus Christ risen in this garden, and the wounds or the bones that keep the marks of wounds are singing. It's noon, there are no shadows, this is true. He raised them and himself is rising up. Also, poor Yorick. That was judgment, it is over. Later in the day, the prince arrives, stepping from his script as from a carriage, drawn up among the holes in which the dead waited, and from which they are all delivered just like an audience, when the play is over, elbowing their coats into the dark. Anxious, a bit deranged, he finds occasion to hold a conversation with a skull. Is it a skull or a stone that looks like a skull? The heads are all gone to heaven, Jesus too. The sexton himself put off his flesh and followed. Ophelia was already on her star. Poor prince, alone with just a book of ballads, with just the plot, nothing can raise him from. So the book that Peter just kindly published for me is a book called Talking to Stanley on the Telephone, and the Stanley of the title is Stanley Moss, probably my oldest friend. He came to read at Oxford when I was an undergraduate 50 odd years ago, and he is now in his 90-somethingth year. Has just had his driving license renewed so that he can drive until he's 104, and may he drive until he's 124. And he telephones me quite frequently. We exchange poems, and he writes wonderful poems himself. The book itself is dedicated to another poet older than myself. I love poets older than myself for some reason. I suppose when I first started publishing, most of the poets I was publishing, I was rediscovering rather than discovering, or many of them. Poets like C.H. Sisson and Donald Davy, who remain very dear to me, and poets like Elizabeth Jennings as well. But occasionally, an older poet will find me out, a poet who hasn't yet, as it were, got the fame he deserves. And the poet to whom I've dedicated the book is a man called Miles Burrows. And Miles sent me some poems for Peer Review. And I found myself laughing aloud as I read them. They were absolutely wonderful. They were also very moving. And when the more I write to and very occasionally meet with Miles, the more I realize that he's a very modern poet, but also utterly Edwardian in lots of ways, in his use of language, in his strange diction and so on. So it's a wonderful sort of divided person, modern and yet a living Edwardian. He's wonderful and very surprising and full of mischief. So those are, in a sense, the two muses that dominate Talking to Stanley on the Telephone. Both of them come into one of the poems that I shall read at the end. Now, Peter has particularly asked me to read the first poem that I'm going to read, Exceptions, Texas 1950, because it relates to a period when my family had an avocado orchard in California, and I, of course, it was being a 4-year-old, 5-year-old child, I was traveling up and down with them when we drove from Mexico to California to the ranch. And it was the first time I saw a sign telling people that they, of a certain nationality, that they couldn't come into a restaurant. So this is the poem. Exceptions, Texas 1950. Yes, I could read. No dogs or Mexicans, the large round caps declared. Papa, we can't go in. My new red passport said as much. They don't mean us. He pushed open the loud screen door to a stale interior. Little white serviettes defined the seating plan. Ketchup, French mustard, our bug-spattered Pontiac with dust-dulled number plates said Mexico DF. It shivered in the heat. He was right. They didn't mean us. We fit, our skin at home. The slow-bladed ceiling fan made shadows surge and plunge like breathing. They served us up the stuff they'd eat themselves, unspiced, prepared for the littlest bear, neither too salty nor sweet, not too hot or too cold. We sipped, we smeared bland red and yellow on our burgers, overdone. And grinning there, alert, infernal black and brown, a monster Doberman. That poem, by the way, was written in syllabics. I love syllabics. They're such a wonderful way of forcing you to cut words out. That picture you saw of the Cookham Resurrection by Stanley Spencer on the cover of my previous book is the picture that animates this next poem called Anniversary, which I think is probably about my mother, whose funeral I attended in Santa Barbara many years ago in California, and I've not been able to get back. And this is a kind of vexed memory. When I'm sleeping, things occur. You come back from the dead. I lift the big stone off you. It weighs no more than a feather. You stand and stretch and look, though not at me because I am asleep. You walk right through me. You leave prints in the dirt, and your shadow moves close beside you, shadow cast by moonlight, as though an intimate has come back with you, holding your hand, sharing your pulse and posture. You have upon you the smell of mildew and soil, and that sweetness you always wore is palpable. And yes, you walk right through me, and I feel your heart again pummeling the bone bars inside your chest. And in your throat and lungs, the rasping that killed you, not the phlegmy prelude to your funeral, more now like a hoarse hymn of resurrection. Down at the cemetery gate, you linger, step out into the road with its yellow lamps. Look, your shadow also, towards town, then uphill. No one familiar, no one, not even a car. You turn and come back in and go back home to the place we put you, marked and in time forgot. Walking right through me, you find the spot among the pine shrubs by the wind-shaped oak. Lie down again and pull the soil tight up under your chin and close your hazel eyes. The big stone weighs too much for me. Your shadow helps me replace it. Daylight comes in. There is a competition in the Times Literary Supplement each year to choose the funniest title ever. And some of the funniest ancient titles were mentioned in an article some years ago. And the funniest title for me was a book called Alone with a Hairy Ainu, or 3,800 Miles on a Pack Saddle in Yezo and a Cruise to the Kurile Islands by A.H. Savage Landor, who was Walter Savage Landor's son, 1893. This poem is based on that strange title. And really, I'm not quite sure what it's about. It always sort of amuses me. It was one of the first sort of, when I first wrote it, I thought it wasn't anything. And then I started writing other poems in a similar tone, and I realized it was starting something. I was reading Alone with a Hairy Ainu. It was the only book in the house. Light was fading. The house was cold. The smell of cooking from next door said fish and cabbage, fish and cabbage. Even fish and cabbage would have been nice. I had never been to Japan, and to my knowledge had never met or even seen an Ainu. The descriptions made them feel warm, like stuffed animals or rugs or fur coats. It was so cold, I almost forgot that they were people, and imagined wrapping myself in one, or pressing myself between two and getting warm like a toasted cheese and ham panini. Then as night came on and the pages disappeared in shadow, I kept saying to myself, you're among them, they're your friends, they're your fuel, they're your illumination. If you get much hungrier, you may have to eat one. I went to sleep, and when I woke up, it was dark. There were no Ainu, and I was alone in the ice-cold house with only the one book, no light, no duvet, no food. I could have eaten even cabbage, even fish, but next door had its dinner, washed its plates. The only smells were ice and snow and drains. I felt a longing so intense for the hairy Ainu. Aunt or mother, sister Ainu, niece, I could have married one or all of them. I could have hugged them. I was so in love, not for the first time. and they weren't at home. The next poem, I think, had something to do with watching a rather famous wedding on television. It's called St. Thomas's, and remembering a number of weddings I've been to and inventing, as it were, a ceremony. He's getting married. I've been there. I've been married in a much bigger church than this one, but emptier, with fewer flowers. I don't remember any flowers. I did not have bridesmaids or page boys either. No crimson sashes, buttonholes at the door, no mournful bagpipes, kilts, or a long black limo. The petals, I didn't have petals strewn up the aisle to the altar, or a printed order of service with portraits, his and hers. In my congregation, I wrote 12 restless acquaintances, one in-law in yellow, an edgy fat priest. Was there music? The memory is entirely devoid of sound. St. Thomas's, on the other hand, while we wait, has music. It makes you think, my neighbor whispers, without saying just what it makes you think about. Worse than that, worse than think, it makes you remember, I want to reply. He's getting married to her, despite what he knows of all she's been up to. And it's hard not to laugh, but she'll be swathed in white like butter never melted, and a veil that he'll draw back like bedroom curtains after a night of love in the dark, and there she'll be. What will she look like at that moment when she's it, forsaking all other until death for the time being? He's not much better. She knows about that, I suppose. Half the men here waiting for her big entrance on her lap of honor up the rosy nave know him as she never will, myself among them. The blocks we've been around, a city of them. He stands there in black awaiting white, like ink patient for paper, like night, all those nights, who knows his day will come, though he's put it off and off, successfully until now. The organ swells. She emerges with Papa, to whose elbow she adheres, a sail fixed to a stocky mast, a spinnaker, say. She billows, navigating with effort because of the train, the impossible heels, and the child in utero a little longer. The father, looking surprised, is sweating. He sort of struts beside her. They arrive at the first pew where the mother is dabbing her eyes and lips and averts her gaze. The groom steps away from his shadow to receive her. Attached, they turn as instructed to the priest. He welcomes them, and there is God behind him, and behind God the tunnel of the future, and behind that all the pasts in a tangle, debris of accidents that happen time after time. No one admits to any just let or hindrance. They declare their vows with a memorized inflection, and are proclaimed. You may kiss the bride, the priest says. Not you may kiss the groom. And we applaud, as at a performance when the curtain's falling, and we are released to go out into the rain and make our own way back 5 blocks to the reception in the Olympia ballroom to wait the limo, and there'll be speeches, backslapping. The new couple will lead out the first dance, and eventually the guests will melt away into the rain. It's always raining unless it's snowing. I've been there, I've been married. It wasn't all that bad. The next poem, I have edited one out for reasons of decency. This one is also slightly indecent, but I hope you can bear with it. It's about a crown. And it's about a crown that fell off. And the same crown has just fell off 2 days ago. So I feel I may have another poem that will have to be written once it's restored. And this is the same dentist that I'm going back to have it restored. The third time the crown fell off and I had to go back, in the waiting room, there was a new hello to wait with. On this occasion, the amalgam had come loose in a piece of fruit cake and I swallowed it. Next day, it signaled to me from the toilet pan, as if it was a thumbnail of silver escaping a lump of ore. Prospector, I gingerly prized it out, broke it free, rinsed it off, and let it soak all day in a mug of Listerine. I read hello. It was the Megan's pregnant number, and wondered whether my dentist, Mr. Osman Lebat, would like to know how the crown had been retrieved, or would he prefer once again to restore it, batten it down without the backstory, with his usual parting injunction to mind how you go, after all his thick rubber fingers had enlarged my mouth, tugging, pushing, packing down, leaving the crown again too high so the mouth can't quite close, like a verse with rather too many syllables jockeying for position in the final line. And then a poem which is the last poem in this section, called Bedside Table, and the book is described as being about old age and getting old. Excuse me while I drink some more of this gin. This is probably the oldest poem in the book. There were three poems that I took out of the book at the very last moment, and they were even older, but I think Peter allowed me to remove them for good reason. Bedside Table. By the way, I'm not as old as the poem makes me out to be here, because I do not have false teeth. These are my own, apart from the crown, and I don't use hearing aids. I put my specs on an open book under the lamp on the bedside table, and they start to read. They gather pace, they skim, turning the pages somehow, fast as fingers. I remove and set my dentures on the plate by the book. They start pronouncing words, the words the specs read. My false teeth and my spectacles, I am attentive as a child. They're telling a story. If I'd put new batteries in my hearing aids, I might have followed. As it is, just crackling. Maybe the story is one where I still have hair. I'm rather young. I have a lover who's young, darker than I am, smaller, stronger too, talking my first language with a cheeky accent, then picking up a book, not one I've written, and conning silently, only his lips are moving. It's the Bible again, because he wants to be good and thinks somehow the book may tell him the secret. He finds it raises more questions than it answers, and he has no intention of changing the way we live, but he persists the way some Catholics do. The specs read, the teeth pronounce the story, chuckling, clacking. They may even be laughing. Is this the book I ought to be writing? The one for which they paid a good advance and gave a deadline that passed 2 years ago? If I could hear, I might take dictation. Or rather than the volume under contract, is it the story I always wanted to write about my other life? Not the actual past with its years of detour, its catalogue of blunders, those bankruptcies, those broken hearts both ways, but a past back projected from a happy ever after, making fairy tales sense, harvest home piled high. My lover who's young in the story is still around. Without my specs, I can't see. I feel his temperature. I remember who he was. Is that all written down? Look, my specs gaze in his direction and my dentures smile at his warmth and would be glad to kiss him if only they had lips. I reach to touch him and the bedside light goes out. The specs stop reading and abruptly sleep. The teeth sigh, clamp shut. The book folds its hands in the dark across its stomach and snores. The bed vibrates with it. It's as if the bed is singing in short snatches a ballad, maybe, or a hymn with its own illusions, the celestial city, angels up and down like lift attendants in a grand hotel. Ah, here he is, my lover, very warm beside me. His darkness, his downed hard arm, his breathing, the same for decades. Still, the space between us in years is unchanged, though my eyes have debts, my teeth depart like old folk from the parish. And we still say we love each other, to each other, and know what we mean or think we know. That's what the book Under the Lamp should be about. I run my tongue over my pitted gums. I lick my lips as if I'm about to say something. Here endeth the second lump of reading. Peter, would you allow me, please, to disappear for 2 minutes? This is part of being old.
Yes.
Perhaps being old is having lighted bathrooms. I'll be right back.
Yes. Well, this is the time to ask people to be sending in questions, if you would, to the chat that you'd like to ask Michael about anything to do with tonight's reading, or indeed anything at all. Michael's one of those people who knows most things. While his back is turned, I won't read it, but the poem that he left out is called The Bath. And it's one of the shorter poems in the book, and one of the most complete, I think, in that it's cheeky in the way that The Dentist is, but it's also poignant and about, well, it's about aging, and it's a really wonderful. And I'm saying this to you, that if you get a chance to get hold of this book, then do read The Bath. It's worth buying the book just for The Bath, even though you're not going to hear it tonight. It does have a couple of words that after the watershed. I need to remind you that there's a bundle and discount now. This means that the books, this book is available post-free if you get the code from the chat or from our website. And you can also buy this book and the very selected that Michael's reading from earlier, which normally retails at £7.50. You can get the both of them for £15 post-free. This is a time-sensitive offer, apparently. I'm glad you're back, Michael.
You've done the commercial, have you? Sorry, that was a commercial. That's what we should have booked it as, a commercial break, yes.
Rather lovely. Those are just remarkable poems. You must have really, I get the sense that you really enjoyed writing them. Is that right?
Well, what I'm enjoying at the moment is being able to read them off the screen. I thought I couldn't, but the way wonderful Katie, who's behind the scenes and is a wizard herself, and so is Susanna, has been projecting them, I'm able to see them, and it's very, very nice. Yes, no, I did enjoy writing them. I mean, the fact that I was writing was the pleasure, I think, as well as the fruit. I quite like the anachronisms that occur in them, and obviously the next poem is full of anachronisms.
The next poem, which is going to be the encore, I think of it as, is called About Homer. And he's giving a series, a reading tour, isn't he? And he's signing parchment and, well, selling parchment anyway. But we'll get to that in a little while. When you were writing them, did you write the poems in bursts? Did you write one at a time? And when you'd written it, did you know you'd finished it? You didn't revise very much. There were one or two that you'd send through a new version, but mostly they seem very fluent.
This lot of poems have come more spaced out than any that I've written before. Usually I have, as you know, a burst where something suddenly comes into focus, and I do a series like, Change of Affairs or The Love of Strangers, which make a lot of sense together, and they come together. One, as it were, unstoppers the next, and so on. But these have come from a great, with great gaps between them. And I'm sorry about this, because I love the feeling of being in a book, and I didn't quite have that feeling with this book. I haven't felt that I was in it. But then when we put it all together, I realized that there was a hole there. W-H-O-L-E, that is.
Yes.
And you then decided the best thing to do was to order them in a certain way, and as usual, you were right.
That's very nice of you to say. Michael?
Well, you're one of those editors who really is. You often see what your authors are trying to do, and suggest to them, this is probably what you're trying to do, and they realize, oh yes, that is exactly what I was trying to do. I know a number of your authors now, and I think most of them are quite grateful for your editorial counsel.
I always say when you praise my editing, Michael, that I've learnt everything I know from you. And there's some questions have come in now. From Ian McLachlan, great event, great reading, Michael. Did you have any Hamlet-alluding work in mind while writing also for Yorick, e.g. Eliot's Prufrock, Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead? The toenails, on the other hand, that's one of the lines from that book I remember. Anyway.
It is almost certainly the case that I did have them in mind, not consciously in mind. Prufrock, obviously, well, it's a Portrait of a Lady, even more than Prufrock. is among my favorite poems, and obviously has always haunted me. And my favorite poem of all of Eliot's poems is the very first poem in the first book, which is La figlia che piange. I don't know how it works. Sometimes these cogitations still amaze the troubled midnight and the noon's repose. You know, it's pretentious and over the top and utterly ravishing. You know, it's great stuff. And also there is a voice there. I'm not terribly keen on my own voice, so I try and create other voices to speak the poems. And I guess that's part of the fun of writing these longer poems, because you get into another character, another set of circumstances lived and imagined.
Yes. Neil Astley, Neil and Pamela from Lullax. Neil wrote on the back of your book, didn't he? Wrote a comment. Age has not diminished Michael Schmidt's boyish wonder at the world, but rather made his questioning of the foibles of its fickle folk all the merrier and more poignant. Wry, playful monologues puzzling over what can only be unpacked or more often left equivocal in the poem itself. Reading this book, we find ourselves in the stimulating company of a poet conversationalist par excellence, listening to what might feel addressed to us while eavesdropping on what is clearly not. That's another editor's insight, isn't it? He doesn't have a question, he has a request. He would like you to read Walkie Talkie. Now, this, you hadn't expected to do this, and we haven't got it up on screen, but perhaps you'd give it a go. He says it's such an hilarious poem, and I agree.
Well, it was the first, oddly enough, I was in Holland with Pamela and Neil, and I wrote this poem on the way back, and it was the first poem in this book. And so in a sense, Neil and I have a long history of not being friends, and then we now have a growing history of being friends, which is a great relief. We were rival publishers, and I really enjoyed his company, and Pamela was great as well. So they went down one corridor, as it were, to their flight, and I went down another corridor to mine in the Amsterdam airport. And this is just how I passed the time, because my plane was delayed. I'm at the airport. Gulls take off and are landing. It is Terminal 3. I started at Terminal 1 in error and sprinted along the moving walkways, dragging my wheelie bag with its plaintive wheel, scattering small change and apologies. Now my plane is late, and now my plane is cancelled. I spend €1 and sit on an Alibaba airport massage chair and jitter to calm my nerves. It doesn't last very long. I get up unsteadily and stand still for a moment, thinking what and why. Then I give in to the music and the pulsing lights. I walk from outlet to outlet. I buy from a huge rack an inflatable striped neck halter, red and yellow, which I blow up. Then at the duty-free, I spray Hugo Boss Intense, Hugo Boss Motion, Night, Orange, Man of Today, Eau de Toilette, Scent for Him, Energize, Just Different, Iced, on my left wrist with my right hand, on my right wrist with my left. I can't get the smells off by rubbing with spit on a tissue. I stand like a queasy lamppost 10 civet cats have visited and the steaming contents of their perineal glands on. Then go to the gents and scrub with scentless soap. In electronics, I try the headsets, Sony, Beats, Bose, Uesu. I settle on the yellow and black Binatone walkie-talkie, discounted. 2 handsets with a 3-kilometer range. Then return to the massage chair to adjust my purchases, take off my backpack, gather it into my lap. As if it were a child, I wanted to stay asleep. I put on my halter and spend another €1. We two, backpack and I, sit together, vibrating for the precisely 3 minutes our money buys, after which I settle into the not quite soft upholstery. Like a stone, I begin to sink away from rainbow neons into dozing turquoise sea light, down and down in tepid dark, without coming to rest, down, down, a flat stone that does not plummet, but rocks right, left, as if, like a seed, it had some intelligence beyond physics, and knew what it was doing, how it almost danced, except it was alone and sank, keeping time, into time, going deeper, deeper, Finding No Seabed. Just actually looking at the end there, I do believe there is a touch of proof rock about it. I mean, obviously not qualitatively, but
The mermaids singing each to each.
That's right. There's even echoes.
It's rather wonderful. The ending. I mean, you earn that ending, as it were, by what you give us before. But that's a really three-dimensional and musical ending, which is its own purpose. But you have to get there. It's a rather wonderful thing. We've had one more question in from David Cameron. You know David Cameron?
We corresponded.
Michael, we are both admirers, and you were a friend of C.H. Sisson. Has he influenced your own poems? The shape of some of these new poems remind me of some of these more formal poems. Do you want to say something quickly about that, and maybe one or two other poets that you feel have made a difference to you as a writer?
Well, Sisson has made a huge difference to me as a writer. He was the first, I think, major poet, and I still see him as a very major poet and poet critic that I took on board when I must have been in my very early 20s. And yes, he's very hard, because he's such a wise and such a deeply read poet. It's very hard for one who is not wise and deeply read to get much from him. So though I thought I was getting a lot from him when I was much younger, what I got from him was a sizzle, but not the steak, as it were. And but as the years have passed, I think the debt to him grows deeper and deeper, and it has a lot to do with Anglicanism. It has a lot to do with modernism and with verse form and the way in which you can use it and then unravel it. He's a miraculous poet. He's there. Others, of course, Elizabeth Bishop, who was a great passion of mine. Donald Davy, with whom I had a wonderfully altercacious relationship. We really did love and hate each other, but ended up loving each other, I think. And many of the poets I've worked with, John Ashbery, for example, who've become good friends, and the late Evan Boland, whose critical writing as well as her poetry had a huge impact on opening up my ears. And so, yes, those are just a few. And then often a younger poet, a new poet coming into the list will have an impact on me. And that's exciting too. It'd be invidious to mention names, I think, because there are so many of them. But I think what really excites me about other people's poetry is what they do with form. I'm never particularly interested in what they're writing about. It's how they're writing and how that is realized, and how the poem lives for me. So.
Wonderful. I can see that it's probably time for Homer. Is there anything you want to say about the Homer poem before you read it? This is going to be the outro of the evening, so I'm going to thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if we've said everything we need to say.
I think the thing that people have to be aware of is that it is in a sense a satire on the on performance poetry and on the reading circuit and on the kinds of ambitions that some younger poets and some older poets too seem to have, and to imagine that things that they imagine poetry can do. Homer is above all that, but the people that throng to his readings and to his events maybe aren't. And the images of a kind of almost like a Ginsberg figure going around doing his gigs, but he's blind, and he is the historical, insofar as there is an historical Homer, he is the historical Homer, but he's also a very familiar poetry figure. And so I take on board the legends of his life, that he was blind and so on, but also as I say, the anachronisms have to be allowed for. And into the poem comes Stanley, and hello Stanley, and into the poem comes Miles. Miles read classics at Oxford at Wadham College, the college I went to myself. So I just imagined him joining me at this reading, or imagined him, but he doesn't join me. So shall I start?
It's been a wonderful reading, Michael, and this is a tour de force. It's 5 pages of
I'm sorry, yes, it is
quickly moving and full of incident poetry, which is a kind of key poem, I think, for our times. Anyway,
I'll read it as fast as I can. Thank you, Peter, and thank you so much for doing the book, which I love. This Katie worked on this cover with me. She did about 50 different versions, and I think what's come out is really quite handsome. I love it. Very good. Okay, and I won't read the epigraph in Greek, but it means even Homer nods. About Homer and Apollyon. Homer is old. He nods at everything. Tell me, O Muse, does he mean yes or no? Perhaps he means perhaps. He nods agreeably. He sneezes into a red bandana the size of a bath towel. It's no surprise to see him. He tops the bill. His presence has drawn the poets out. Every single one wants to be like him. Well, not blind, not old, but immortal. Name turned adjective. He can still stand on his pair of ancient feet in Birkenstocks, Arizona regular, a grizzled statue roused from stone by archaeology and adoration. His jaw drops. He wails like an opera diva, spilling coloratura, then basso, bottomless. The poets want to be like him, not write like him, not write at all, in fact, perform. They want ovation, laurel crowns, tripods, money. How does he do it? The audience eats out of his palm like a chicken pecking corn. All the applause and half the ticket sales are his, and he wins prizes despite his years. Dear Miles, I wish you were sitting here, cross-legged beside me. You read him in Greek a long time ago at Wardham. How would it be to come to the singer of tales when you're old yourself? Lord and Perry were wrong. He's not a tradition. He's skin and bone and a paunch. He needs a haircut. You can smell him in the back row, armpits, onions. He's senior to everyone else, even to Stanley, who's got 10 years on you. You got 10 on me, go figure. He's famously blind too, as a bat, with nowadays a yellow guide dog and a white probing cane. There was a time when a boy in scuffed chiton and sandals led him from gig to gig all over the classical world. Attica, Boeotia, Corinth, Delphi, by boat to Lesbos, Mytilene, even Crete, and on the way home, Spartan Sparta. Going from city to city, they sometimes begged a ride on a wagon, or Homer did, while the boy cantered beside. Hospitality was generally sparse. Listeners listened out, and cheered for their local heroes. After recital, those that could read and had money bought scrolls. One of the boy's jobs was to hump the scroll shop from venue to venue on his little back and ring up the drachmas. They'd get Homer to sign, steadying his twisted fingers on a biro. When you think about it, the boy that guided him when Homer first took to the road with poems and blank eye sockets can't have been immortal like the poet. That first boy must have grown up and graduated, gone into farming or arts administration, or set out to be a performer on his own, having heard the old man over and over and over, like a scratched record, a very, very long scratch, retell the somber war of Greeks and Trojans, then, for light relief, the farce of that idiot Odysseus, the irony of the adjective wily lost on audiences, but never on his readers, stumbling and whoring the not very long way home to Ithaca, the tottering house, Penelope, no spring chicken, and taking a decade to get there. Then, as soon as he does, and the dog wags its venerable tail, slaying everything male that might have to be described as a suitor, apart from his son, who set out to seek him at every bordello and inn on the Ionian harbors, and fortunately hasn't made it home yet, or he might have been for it along with the rest. Homer's first guide boy's successor, another bucolic brat, this time for diversity out of parched Thessaly, or further north, a Macedonian orphan or an urchin from Paeonia, will have earned crusts, kicks, and infrequent caress. Nowadays, dogs get a better deal than boys ever did. What with biscuits, chews, and brushings, regular vet care, no one ever was cruel to a guide dog. Next summer, Homer's current Labrador will give way to a puppy by the name of Waldo from outside Chesterfield. Being so old, Homer snoozes a lot of the time, Before recitals, he sits bolt upright on his stool and sleeps like a baby. He doesn't look asleep, his sockets ajar. If he held a paper cup, folk would drop coins in, pat the dog and give him the time of day. He knows his poems off pat. Or is it rather that each time he pulls the first line like a cork out of his heart, the old story wells up new as vintage ichor and steaming? Though you know just where the story's leading, the words, always the same, carry a sense unique to the moment of utterance. You're charmed again. The wine-dark sea is one time Thessalian Limnonia, and the next Moscofilero, or just plain Retsina. The gray of Athene's eyes may be sea mist, a churning dolphin, ash, whirled pearl, or pumice. He leads us on the story's single journey. We bring, each of us, different luggage, and arrive uniquely grieving, safe and sound, at Hector's ritual obsequies. Being old myself, I've packed a thermos of brandy, a knapsack with fruit and sandwiches, a rug, plus a change of clothes in case the poem's journey extends beyond the advertised time and the last train home. My mobile is fully charged so I can take photos. His recitals vary a lot, though the words spoken are the same each night. The torches cast different shadows. Whatever Homer sees is outline. We fill in dimension and hue. The poem latches on to each listener. It keeps me watching the dog who's delivered the poet on stage and sits like Patience by his side, not listening but lolling its tongue, then gnawing at an itch slowed down by its pink boner. Eventually the dog subsides, puts its chin on its paws. It starts snoring gently, its legs twitch. Homer marches us on into battle again. Swords drawn, we hack at the waves, we rush the wine-dark tide. Tell me, O Muse, will the story ever be over? Thank you very much for listening and for coming. Bye.